June 19, 1944. High above the Philippines Sea. The sun reflects off endless water, blinding through scratched canopies. Engine noise fills the cockpit, steady, familiar, trusted. A Japanese Zero pilot scans the sky, searching for the enemy that has not yet appeared. Then radar warnings ripple through the formation below. American carriers have launched from the east. Dark shapes emerge fast, heavy, closing with unnatural speed. These are not the fragile fighters the Zero once outearned with ease. They are larger, broader, relentless. As the distance collapses, the first burst of gunfire tears through the air. 6.50 caliber machine guns speak at once. A Zero shudders, then vanishes in flame. The Japanese pilot banks hard, instinctively pulling into a tight turn. It should work. It always has. The American fighter does not follow. It climbs, rolls, comes back down like a falling weight of steel. In seconds, the sky becomes chaos contrails. Burning wreckage, parachutes that never open. Radios crackle with confusion. Veterans realize something is wrong. The rules of air combat have changed, and no one told them. In this moment, inside shrinking cockpits and widening skies, Japanese naval aviation meets an enemy it no longer understands and cannot outrun. To understand why this encounter felt so sudden, so brutally one-sided, it is necessary to return to the beginning of the air war in the Pacific, when the balance looked entirely different. In December 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was the most feared carrier-based fighter in the world. It was light, it was agile, and in the hands of Japan's elite naval aviators it was lethal. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero reflected Japan's strategic priorities. It sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for range and maneuverability. In pre-war planning, Japanese commanders believed battles would be decided by skilled pilots flying long distances over open ocean, striking first and decisively. Survivability was secondary to performance. Early results seemed to prove them right. During the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval aviation swept across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros dominated the skies with little resistance. In the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground or outclassed in the air. American pilots quickly learned to fear the Zero's turning ability. Attempting to dogfight it at low speed was often fatal. Entire squadrons were lost by clinging to outdated tactics. By mid-1942, the Zero's reputation had become almost mythical. But that reputation hit a fragile foundation. Japanese pilot training before the war was long, selective, and brutally demanding. Only the best candidates completed it. The result was a small corps of extraordinarily skilled aviators, but one that could not be easily replaced. Attrition changed everything. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 marked a turning point. While the Zero remained formidable, Japan lost irreplaceable pilots. At Midway alone, hundreds of experienced aircrew were killed along with for fleet carriers. Aircraft could be replaced. Expertise could not. Japan's training system struggled to adapt. Shortened courses produced pilots with fewer flight hours and less combat readiness. Meanwhile, the war expanded. Losses mounted. By 1943, the average Japanese pilot entering combat had a fraction of the experience of his predecessors. Still, doctrine did not change. Japanese naval aviation continued to emphasize individual skill, close-range combat, and aggressive engagement. The Zero, unchanged in its fundamental design, remained central to this philosophy. Commanders trusted what had once worked, even as conditions shifted against them. This created a dangerous illusion. Japanese pilots entering battles in 1943 and early 1944 believed they were flying a proven weapon. They trusted its agility. They trusted their training. Many expected to meet the same cautious American fighters they had once defeated. They did not yet understand that the enemy had been learning carefully, methodically, and preparing an answer that would not fight the Zero on its terms. That answer was already waiting on American carrier decks. Engines warming, designed not to outrun the Zero, but to destroy it outright. While Japanese naval aviation clung to what had once brought victory, the United States was rebuilding its air power from the ground up. Early defeats in the Pacific were not ignored. They were dissected. American pilots who survived encounters with the Zero returned with hard lessons. They reported an enemy fighter that could outrun anything in the sky, but one that burned easily, lacked protection, and lost performance at high speed. Engineers listened. Commanders adjusted. Training manuals were rewritten. The response was not immediate, but it was deliberate. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was tasked with building a fighter designed for carrier warfare, not dueling elegance. The result was the F6F Hellcat. Where the Zero was light, the Hellcat was heavy. Where the Zero relied on agility, the Hellcat relied on power. Where the Zero avoided damage, the Hellcat was built to absorb it. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney RT800 double wasp engine producing over 1,000 horsepower, the Hellcat could outclimb and outspeed the Zero at most altitudes. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns with massive ammunition reserves. Most critically, it was armored. Self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot protection meant it could take hits and keep flying. The Hellcat was not designed to dogfight. It was designed to dominate. At the same time, American pilot training underwent transformation. Unlike Japan's elite, limited pipeline, the United States built a massive, standardized system. Thousands of pilots were trained using the same doctrine, the same tactics, the same emphasis on teamwork over individual heroics. Combat experience was fed directly back into training schools. Tactics like the thatch we've developed earlier to counter the Zero were now second nature. American pilots were taught never to turn with a Zero, to use altitude, speed, and coordinated attacks. By late 1943, Hellcats began arriving in force. By early 1944, they dominated carrier air groups across the Pacific. American production ensured that losses could be replaced quickly. Japanese losses could not. The stage was set not for a close contest, but for an imbalance. Japanese pilots would soon discover that the aircraft approaching them were not there to test skill or bravery. They were there to apply overwhelming force with precision and to do so repeatedly, without mercy. That realization would not come from reports or briefings. It would come in combat. For Japanese pilots, the first encounters with the Hellcat were deeply unsettling. They entered combat expecting a contest of skill. That expectation had been drilled into them from the beginning: tight turns, close-range fire, individual mastery of the machine. The Zero had always rewarded those instincts. The Hellcat did not. As American fighters approached, Japanese pilots attempted familiar maneuvers, pulling into sharp turns to force an overshoot. Instead, the Hellcats climbed away effortlessly, refusing the engagement. Moments later, they returned from above, firing in controlled bursts before pulling up again. This was not arrogance. It was doctrine. Zeros that should have escaped simply disintegrated under concentrated fire. Fuel tanks ignited. Control surfaces vanished. Pilots who survived the first pass found themselves unable to catch or outearn an enemy that would not stay in the fight. More disturbing than the losses was the realization that skill no longer mattered in the same way. Veteran pilots, men who had survived years of combat, found themselves outmatched by younger Americans flying heavier aircraft with calculated restraint. The shock was psychological. Radio calls reflected confusion. Pilots reported enemies that would not turn, that fell from the sun, that refused to chase. These were not mistakes. They were signs of a new reality. The Zero was no longer dictating the fight. The contrast between the Zero and the Hellcat was not accidental. It was philosophical. The Zero embodied Japan's pre-war assumptions: long range, extreme agility, and pilot confidence. Its lack of armor made it light but fragile. At high speeds, its control stiffened. In dives, it risked structural failure. The Hellcat was built for survival. It could dive faster than the Zero. It retained control at speed. Its armor protected the pilot long enough to escape. Even when damaged, it often returned to the carrier. In combat, this meant American pilots could make mistakes and live. Japanese pilots often could not. Technology had begun to decide outcomes before the trigger was pulled. The Hellcat forced a change in the geometry of air combat. Instead of turning fights, engagements became vertical. Altitude mattered more than finesse. Energy replaced elegance. American pilots attacked in pairs and sections, covering each other, rotating in and out of combat. Japanese pilots, increasingly inexperienced, struggled to adapt. The old tactics no longer applied. What once felt like combat now felt like execution. And as this pattern repeated, the imbalance grew impossible to ignore, setting the stage for even harsher truths still to come. By 1944, the difference between Japanese and American pilot training had become decisive. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviators often entered combat with over 700 flight hours. They were masters of their aircraft, trained through years of demanding instruction. But those men were gone, lost at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. And in the grinding attrition that followed, their replacements were rushed. As fuel shortages worsened and aircraft production lagged, training hours were cut drastically. New pilots sometimes arrived at the front with fewer than 150 hours in the cockpit. Carrier landing practice was minimal. Combat formation flying was often theoretical rather than experienced. In contrast, American pilots were arriving with standardized training, extensive gunnery practice, and constant tactical updates. They were not expected to be aces. They were expected to survive, coordinate, and win as a group. In a war of attrition, that difference was fatal. Japanese naval leadership struggled to adjust. despite mounting losses. Doctrine remained rooted in pre-war assumptions. The Zero was still expected to dominate through maneuverability. Calls for improved armor or new fighter designs came too late. The replacement aircraft that did emerge arrived in limited numbers and faced the same pilot shortages. American leadership adapted relentlessly. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz emphasized air superiority as the foundation of every operation. Carrier task forces were structured around layered defense, radar detection, fighter interception, and coordinated strikes. Hellcats were positioned to intercept before Japanese aircraft could even see the fleet. This was not bravery against bravery. It was system against system. For Japanese pilots, the realization was devastating. Courage had not failed them. Skill had not abandoned them. The world around them had changed. Some pilots reported a moment mid-combat when they understood survival was unlikely. Not because of fear, but because of arithmetic. Enemy numbers, enemy speed, enemy resilience. The Hellcat did not hate them. It simply did not care that cold efficiency would reach its peak in a single, overwhelming confrontation where realization became certainty. And Japanese naval aviation broke an open sky. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea begins before most pilots ever see the enemy. At dawn, American radar operators aboard Task Force 58 detect incoming Japanese aircraft at extreme range, over 150 miles out. This alone signals how much the war has changed. In earlier battles, visual contact decided everything. Now, electronics speak first. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa has committed the bulk of Japan's remaining carrier air power. His plan depends on reach. Japanese aircraft will strike from distances American pilots believe impossible. It is a final gamble to regain initiative in the air, but the gamble is already compromised. Hellcats are launched early, climbing to altitude in disciplined waves. They do not rush. They wait above the fleet, engines steady, pilots briefed and calm. Radar vectors guide them precisely toward the approaching formations. The first interceptions occur shortly after 10 a.m. Japanese pilots see American fighters descending out of the sun fast, ordered, and numerous. Formations break instinctively. Zeros turn hard, trying to draw enemies into close combat. Hellcats refuse. They slash through once. Then again, each pass is brief and lethal. Concentrated fire shreds wings and fuselages. Zeros ignite, shedding debris across empty sky. Pilots who eject often fall into open ocean far from any rescue. Japanese radios fill with frantic calls. Leaders attempt to reform groups that no longer exist. Inexperienced pilots lose sight of their wingmen. Veterans realize they are fighting a battle already lost. By midday, the pattern is unmistakable. The Hellcats are not merely winning engagements. They are preventing Japanese aircraft from reaching the American fleet at all. Those that slip through face layered anti-aircraft fire and additional fighter screens. The sky itself has become hostile for Japanese pilots. This is the moment disbelief gives way to understanding. Not panic. Not rage. Recognition. They are no longer facing an opponent they can outfly or outthink. They are facing a system designed to destroy. Then before courage or skill can matter, that recognition will harden into certainty as the day continues and the losses multiply beyond anything Japan can afford. By the afternoon of June 19th, the scale of the disaster can no longer be concealed. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft fail to return. Those that do are damaged, scattered, or nearly out of fuel. Carrier decks meant to receive them remain empty, silent, exposed. The airspace above Task Force 58, by contrast, is crowded with returning Hellcats, many marked with fresh victory symbols. The engagement will later be given a name: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At the time, it does not feel like a joke. It feels like annihilation. American after-action reports record extraordinary numbers. More than 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. Fewer than 30 American planes lost to enemy action. Many Hellcat pilots claim multiple kills in a single sortie, not through reckless pursuit, but through disciplined execution. Japanese command realizes the truth too late. Ozawa's carriers are still afloat, but their air groups are effectively gone. Pilots who survived are often too inexperienced to land safely. Some ditch beside their carriers and drown. Others crash on approach. The air arm that once carried Japan across the Pacific has been erased in hours. On June 20th, a final desperate Japanese strike is launched at extreme range. American carriers respond with a risky pursuit at dusk, pushing Hellcats to the edge of fuel limits. Even then, the imbalance holds. More Japanese aircraft fall. American pilots land in darkness, some ditching, many rescued. The result is decisive. Japan has lost not just planes, but the ability to contest the air. Without trained pilots, carriers are empty shells. Air power, once Japan's sharpest weapon, is gone. inside surviving Zero cockpits. The realization is absolute. This is no longer a contest of courage. It is a contest already decided. And from this moment forward, the war in the Pacific will move in only one direction toward the Japanese home islands. Unopposed from above. The aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolds with brutal clarity. When the smoke clears and aircraft are counted, the numbers tell a story no rhetoric can soften. Japan has lost more than 400 aircraft over the days, most of them carrier-based fighters and bombers. More devastating than the machines is the loss of men. Hundreds of trained pilots are gone, many of them among the last with meaningful combat experience. American losses are comparatively negligible. Task Force 58 reports fewer than 130 aircraft lost in total, many due to fuel exhaustion during the long-range pursuit on June 20th rather than enemy fire. Most pilots are recovered. Many aircraft are repaired and flying again within days. For the Japanese Navy, this imbalance is catastrophic. Carriers such as Tei, Shikaku, and Hiyu are sunk, not primarily by air attack, but by American submarines exploiting the chaos. Others survive the battle only to become strategically irrelevant. Without air groups, a carrier is little more than a target. Japanese command now faces an irreversible reality. Aircraft production cannot replace pilot losses. Training pipelines are broken. Fuel shortages worsen. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, is now an artifact of an earlier war. Surviving pilots are reassigned hastily. Some are pulled back to defend the Philippines. Others are ordered to conserve fuel, fly fewer hours, and prepare for what is coming. Morale collapses quietly. There are no speeches promising reversal, only silence. American commanders, by contrast, recognize what has been achieved. Air superiority is no longer contested. Amphibious operations can proceed under a protective canopy of fighters. Bombers can strike deeper with fewer losses. The initiative has shifted permanently. The Hellcat has done more than win battles. It has erased Japan's ability to fight in the air. And with that erasure comes a strategic vacuum, one that will soon be filled by desperation, improvisation, and a darker turn in the nature of the war itself. In the months that follow the Philippine Sea, the consequences of air defeat spread across the Pacific. Japan's remaining carrier force is sidelined. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, carriers are used as decoys. Stripped of meaningful air power, the once feared naval aviation arm becomes a shadow, unable to influence events beyond brief, symbolic gestures. On the ground, the loss of air cover is devastating. American bombers operate with increasing freedom. Supply lines are severed. Isolated garrisons wither. Japanese soldiers come to understand that the sky no longer belongs to them. Air attacks arrive without warning, without resistance. For Japanese aviation leadership, options narrow to the unthinkable. With experienced pilots gone and new aircraft unable to compete, the concept of survivability fades. What remains is the weaponization of sacrifice. By late 1944, the first organized kamikaze units are formed, born not from fanaticism alone, but from strategic collapse. The Hellcat's legacy becomes clear in statistics. By war's end, the F6F Hellcat is credited with over 5,000 aerial victories, more than any other allied fighter. Its kill ratio against Japanese aircraft exceeds 19-1. These numbers are not accidents. They are the product of design, training, and doctrine aligned toward a single goal: air dominance. For surviving Japanese pilots, the psychological impact endures. Some record in post-war accounts the moment they understood the war was lost, not in 1945, not with surrender, but in the sky over the Philippine Sea, when Hellcats came from above, refused their turns, and left no room for heroics. The war continued for another year, but its outcome no longer did. And in that realization lies the deeper meaning of this encounter, one that extends beyond aircraft and kill ratios into the nature of modern warfare itself. When the war ended, the flight decks of American carriers fell silent in a way they never had before. Rows of F6F Hellcats sat motionless beneath tropical suns, their folded wings marked with fading victory symbols. These aircraft would never again launch into combat, yet their influence was only beginning to be understood. The Hellcat did not win the Pacific War by elegance or innovation alone. It won by redefining what naval air power was meant to do. Before the war, fighter design often centered on agility and pilot finesse. The Hellcat rejected that logic. It was built around survivability, firepower, and integration into a larger system. Radar, radio coordination, carrier operations, and mass production were not accessories, they were the core of its success. American naval doctrine absorbed this lesson immediately. Post-war fighter development emphasized speed, climb rate, and durability over tight turning performance. The idea of the lone ace dominating the sky faded. In its place emerged the concept of air superiority as an industrial and organizational achievement. Pilots who flew the Hellcat often described it without sentimentality. It was not graceful. It did not flatter mistakes. But it brought them home. That mattered more than reputation. By 1945, the Hellcat had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter in history. Not because it was perfect, but because it was deployed correctly in overwhelming numbers, by pilots trained to fight as part of a machine larger than themselves. Museums would later preserve Zeros as symbols of early war dominance, and Hellcats as symbols of late war inevitability. Together, they tell a story not of good versus evil, but of evolution, of how warfare adapts faster than tradition allows. And while the Hellcat's engines would soon be replaced by jets, its philosophy would remain airborne for decades, shaping how nations understood control of the sky. Yet for those who once faced it from the opposite side, the legacy felt very different: personal, unresolved, and heavy with memory. For the surviving Japanese pilots, the end of organized air combat did not bring relief. It brought emptiness. When they returned to land bases after the summer of 1944, many found airfields stripped bare. Aircraft shortages were severe. Fuel was rationed to the point of immobility. Training flights were canceled. Engines remained cold. The sky they had once lived in was no longer accessible. Those who had survived encounters with Hellcats carried a quiet understanding. They rarely spoke aloud. They had not been defeated by inferior flying. They had been defeated by inevitability. Post-war interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence reveal a consistent theme. Japanese pilots described a moment, often over the Philippine Sea or later over the Philippines, when they realized survival depended less on skill and more on whether they were seen first by radar-guided interceptors. Many admitted that by late 1944, they no longer expected to win engagements. They expected only to delay. This recognition eroded morale in ways official reports never captured. Veterans were ordered to train new pilots despite knowing those trainees lacked time, fuel, and experience. Instructions were simplified. Tactical manuals shortened. The emphasis shifted from return to impact. Survival became secondary to effect. By early 1945, aviation units were being reorganized for missions from which return was not expected. The Zero, once prized for its range and agility, was now used as a delivery system for sacrifice. Weight was stripped away. Armor removed entirely. Fuel loads adjusted for one-way flights. Pilots were briefed not on engagement tactics, but on approach angles. Many of the men assigned to these units had never faced a Hellcat in open combat. Others had and understood exactly why this was happening. In post-war memoirs, surviving aviators often avoided technical discussion. They wrote instead about silence, about standing beside runways at dusk, about watching contrails they could no longer chase, about knowing that the age of Japanese naval aviation had ended not with surrender, but with understanding. An understanding born when American fighters refused to turn, refused to chase, and simply waited for gravity, speed, and numbers to do the work. That understanding would shape how Japan remembered the war in the air and how the world would remember what truly decides victory: when technology, doctrine, and industry align. The clash between the Zero and the Hellcat was never simply a contest between two aircraft. It was a confrontation between two ways of understanding war. Imperial Japan entered the conflict believing that spirit could overcome material limits. Courage, discipline, and mastery of craft were treated as decisive forces. Technology existed to serve the warrior, not to replace him. In the early years, this belief appeared justified. Skilled pilots flying light, responsive machines achieved victories that stunned the world. But modern war does not pause for belief. The United States approached air combat as a problem to be solved systematically. When pilots died, procedures were examined. When aircraft failed, designs were revised. When tactics stopped working, they were abandoned without sentiment. Nothing was sacred except effectiveness. The Hellcat embodied this approach. It did not demand exceptional pilots. It created them. Through armor, firepower, and forgiving flight characteristics, it reduced the cost of error. Through radar coordination and formation tactics, it multiplied individual effort into collective dominance. Spirit still mattered, but only within a system designed to preserve it. For Japanese pilots, this realization came too late. Their courage was undiminished. Their willingness to fight remained absolute. What vanished was the space in which those qualities could change outcomes. The sky no longer rewarded bravery alone. It rewarded preparation. This reckoning reshaped global air doctrine after 1945. Air forces around the world studied the Pacific War and drew the same conclusion. Control of the air would belong to those who combined technology, training, logistics, and adaptability, not to those who relied on tradition, however noble. The age of the individual aerial warrior ended not with a treaty, but in moments like these when a faster aircraft refused to turn, climbed away, and returned with overwhelming force. And once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. Only one final chapter remains, one that looks not at aircraft or pilots, but at the silence that followed, when the sky itself seemed to absorb what had been lost. When the war finally ended, the Pacific sky was empty. No contrails crossed the horizon. No engines echoed over carrier decks. Only wind and water remained. The aircraft that had once filled the air, Zeros and Hellcats alike, were pushed aside, dismantled, or ferried into storage. Some would be scrapped. A few would be preserved. Most would vanish without ceremony, their purpose fulfilled. For the men who flew them, memory lingered longer than sound. American pilots remembered a machine that brought them home. A fighter that asked for discipline, not heroics. One that turned war into procedure and survival into habit. The Hellcat became a benchmark, proof that preparation could outweigh daring, and that air superiority was built long before the first shot was fired. Japanese pilots remembered something else. They remembered the moment the sky stopped listening to them, when tight turns no longer mattered, when skill could not close distance, when the enemy refused to play by familiar rules. For many, that realization, not surrender, marked the true end of the war. The clash between Hellcat and Zero was not about mercy. It was about transition. It marked the passage from an age where courage could dominate into one where systems decided outcomes, where radar replaced eyesight, where numbers outweighed legends, where air combat became less personal and far more decisive. History often speaks loudly about battles. This one spoke through absence, through empty decks, through grounded aircraft, through a sky that no longer needed to be fought over. And in that silence lies the final truth of the Pacific Air War. That empires did not fall because pilots lacked bravery, but because the future arrived faster than tradition could follow. The Hellcats flew on, the Zeros faded away, and the sky moved forward, unchanged by loyalty or sacrifice, remembering only who learned fastest how to control it.